So I'm going to click go live over here, and then
Is it
Brian,
joke time?
yeah, but you know what? I think I made a mistake.
No, it says it's streaming on Facebook right now.
I know, but I think I put it in the wrong place.
Again?
Not again. I'm going to hit cancel, and we're going to
We're taking a break after this.
Why can I hear it already?
Because it's already going.
Somebody has it playing.
Not me.
So the
Is it
world
your
of
mom?
YouTube is going to see this. No, so the world of YouTube is going to see the fact that we had a little snafu getting started with the Facebook, but we're going to try this again live on Facebook. And I'm going to make sure to click the right thing this time. There we go. Okay, and so all right, here we go. So Pharaohs, we are here for Pharaohs of the Bible with Brian Young.
He doesn't get to tell a joke though?
No, he does. Are you ready?
Sure, you bet.
And now go ahead with your joke.
All right. Well, I've been asking a lot of my friends lately what the lowest level or the lowest position in the Army was. And for whatever reason, I can't get an answer. They always keep telling me it's private. I don't know what the big secret is, but maybe one of you can help me out on that later. So anyway.
That's a great joke, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, so I'm Terry Camerzell, and I'm here with Creation Fellowship Santee. We're a group of friends bound by our common agreement that the creation account, as told in Genesis, is a true depiction of how God created the universe and all life from nothing in just 6 days, a few thousand years ago. We've been meeting most Thursday nights here on Zoom since June of 2020. We've been blessed with presentations by pastors, teachers, doctors, cartoonists, scientists, apologists, and all around smarty pants people who love the Lord and have a message to share. You can find most of our past videos by searching Creation Fellowship Santee, that's SANTEE on YouTube. Follow us on our Creation Fellowship Santee Facebook page and sign up for our email list by emailing creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. So you don't miss any of our upcoming speakers. Tonight, we're blessed to have back Brian Young. Brian is an internationally known speaker and author. He was a teacher and principal for 10 years before becoming director of Creation Instruction Association and the Semisaurus Mobile Creation Museum. He has now been speaking on the topic of creation and biblical authority for 25 years, doing debates at universities, going into prisons, and sharing at churches, schools, and camps around the world. He uses the Bible as the foundation for science and education. You can find his ministry online at creationinstruction.org. And if you want to see his last presentation that he did for us, you can find it on our YouTube channel. He did a presentation called Rethinking Adam. And tonight we have him back to talk about Pharaohs of the Bible. So Brian, with that, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, we are going to cover a lot of material here in a short period of time. As a matter of fact, I won't be able to cover everything that I would like to, but we're going to be able to cover some of the most important things because, as you said, we believe that the earth is young. And I believe that every area of science, whether it be biology, geology, astronomy, or archaeology, all will support that. But we often hear things like Jericho is 9,000 years old. And that doesn't seem to fit in with maybe a 6,000-year-old earth. We see in archaeology things 15,000 years old. How does that fit? Well, it all has to do with the pharaohs, believe it or not, that there is a timeline that is corrected. And once you do that, everything's going to line up perfectly. And a lot of the contradictions that there are within archaeology, having these 15,000 and so on, those contradictions go away. And so Luke tells us this in the Bible. It says, if they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one would rise from the dead. And in other words, if you don't hear Moses, if you don't hear Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, if you can't hear those things and understand those things, you're not going to believe in the resurrection. You're not going to believe in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And so it's a very important thing that we have a good grasp and hold of what's going on in these first 5 books of the Bible, because there are a lot of people out there trying to discredit creation, the Exodus, especially those 2 things in those books of the Bible. And so we're going to take a look at that today. Now, the other thing I want you to remember before we get started is archaeology is really about only 10% data and 90% interpretation. And what I mean by that is it's kind of the same thing in science. If I find a fossilized dinosaur bone, that really doesn't tell me much. It tells me that this thing was once alive and it's now dead. It doesn't tell me how it died, what it was eating before it died, any of those kind of things. We have to interpret why we are seeing what we see. And that's the same thing it is with archaeology. So keep that in mind as we go. But when we study Egypt, it's a fascinating place to go and visit. I've been there a couple of times. And when you go there, you see all these kings and these temples, and they would write on their walls telling us about their battles, about their building projects, about all of these kinds of things. They even make statues of themselves, and we know who they are because of the cartouches, these little name tags, you would basically say, on their shoulders. We see that they would write on their obelisks about their temples and the things that they would accomplish and do, their battles, as I said before. They would write on their tomb walls. They would write on everything, all of this information. But the problem was, for a long time, nobody could read what was being said because they used this language of hieroglyphs. And the hieroglyphic language was unknown until Alexander the Great, basically in 332 BC, he went and he conquered Egypt. And so he's going to end the Egyptian dynasties. Well, when he did, he had the priests and some of his scholars make what is called the Rosetta Stone. And you can see that pictured there in the upper right. And what the Rosetta Stone was a key, like a key on a map, but a key for understanding the language. What you see here is that there were 3 different languages on the Rosetta Stone. You had one of them was in the Greek. There was actually 2 Greek, and one Greek and then 2 Egyptian, the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Demotic. And so all 3 of these were saying the exact same thing. Therefore, you could decipher by understanding what the Greek said, what the Egyptian language and hieroglyphs were telling us as well. And so this was basically lost for a long time after Alexander the Great had this written down. It was lost all the way up until basically 1822, when it was finally deciphered. It was found again in the 1500s, but in 1822, there was a French scholar who, for the first time then, since Alexander the Great, from our knowledge, used his skills to decipher this. And from 1822 on, now we were able to understand and read the hieroglyphs. Now, 1822 is really not that long ago. And even then, it was one man who could understand this. So since then, obviously, we have more people who can read Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it's still a very small number of scholars who are able to do that. But by studying this the last 100 years, or a little over now, almost 200 years, we have been able to get quite a bit of information, but it's still growing all the time. Despite all of this, though, we have things like Time magazine that said, is the Bible fact or fiction? And then on the inside of this article, it said there are parts of the Old Testament where the evidence is contradictory or still absent, including slavery in Egypt and the existence of Moses. And so here we see Time magazine, is the Bible really true? Because if you can't believe Genesis, if you can't believe Moses and the prophets, neither will you be persuaded, though one would rise from the dead. I personally think the devil knows that quite well, and that is why he is trying to get you not to believe in creation and not to believe in Exodus or the existence of Moses even. So to understand what we're going to be looking at here, I want you to see the timeline. Now, typically, we see an average of about 3100 BC is where they are telling you the beginning of the Egyptian dynasties took place. And as I said, they end when Alexander the Great conquers them in 322 BC. Now, we have the Exodus primarily as being understood by most scholars today about 1445 BC. On that timeline, that's that green arrow that you're seeing. So it puts the Exodus taking place at the end of the 18th dynasty. Now, the 18th dynasty is when Ramses is ruling, all of these kind of things. But I'm going to show you that I think that this is incorrect, and there's good reasons that it's incorrect. I personally believe that it started around 2100 BC, as you're going to see in a moment. But one of the problems with having the Exodus take place in the 18th dynasty is this. The 18th dynasty, the capital of Egypt is Luxor, not Memphis like the Bible indicates. Luxor is also 1,800 kilometers south of the Delta. That means Moses was going to have to go to the capital city back and forth every time he was talking to Moses, 1,800 kilometers each time. That just is unrealistic. Not only that, but the 18th dynasty is the most recorded of all dynasties. Everything was recorded. If a pharaoh sneezed, it was almost written down. There is that much information. We know more about the 18th dynasty than any other. And so you would think that out of all of the records that we have of the 18th dynasty, just somewhere, we ought to be able to find some evidence of the Exodus that took place, Moses and the Israelites living in Egypt. But nothing. There's none of that there. And so the question is why? Now, it is true that sometimes, when bad things happen, they didn't like to record the negative things. However, you usually can kind of read between the lines and see what was going on. As an example, we see the Lachish tablets. When the Assyrians came in and were conquering Israel, it says they conquered this city, then they went to Lachish, and from Lachish they went on to Jerusalem. And it says that they locked up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. That's what the Assyrian records on the Lachish tablets record. Now, the Bible tells us why, that he didn't conquer them. He's saying, I conquered this guy, I conquered this king, and then this king, and then this king. But with Hezekiah, we only locked him up like a bird in a cage. Why didn't he conquer them? Well, the Bible tells us that there was 185,000 of the Assyrian army that was wiped out in the middle of the night by an angel of death, and they wake up and their army's dead. And so he goes back home, and then later his kids basically kill him in one of the pagan temples. But bottom line is, we can see by reading between the lines that the evidence is there. We don't see any of that in the 18th dynasty here as well. And so that's another problem. Some other ones that we see, Ramses is supposedly the pharaoh. And when you watch things like Prince of Egypt, things like that, you see always it's Ramses that is the one that Moses is going and confronting. I do not believe that that is true. We have been brainwashed because of the media and the children's books and the cartoons in seeing that. And bottom line is, Ramses, he lived into his 80s. He ruled 67 years. And it says that that's, Exodus was, he had to reign less than 40 years because the one who sought to kill Moses had died just before Moses came back. If you recall, what was going on there is Moses had murdered somebody, and so he fled, and he was in the desert before he could come back. And so for Ramses to rule 67 years, the timing is not correct there. It doesn't allow Moses to be gone that long and then to come back. Also, the timing makes everything in the Bible seem wrong. Like I said, Jericho, the date seems to be off on that, so there's some kind of problem. A big problem for me is I've seen Ramses. I've seen his mummy. If you look here, here's a picture of his mummy. The Bible tells me that Pharaoh and his army were buried in the Red Sea. So how am I able to see Ramses? Doesn't make any sense. Now, some people will say, if you look in the book of Exodus, it doesn't specifically say that Pharaoh was buried. However, you go to the book of Psalms and it's talking about it, and it says Pharaoh and his army. So You shouldn't be able to see Ramses at all. The other thing is, during the 18th dynasty, with all these records, there is no evidence that there were Semitic or Jewish people living in Egypt at all. Where'd they go? And you would think that if this is really happening in the Exodus, that there'd be something. And that is why Time magazine is saying there's really no evidence that they ever existed. Why? Because they are focused, laser focused on the 18th dynasty. And there is no evidence of the Exodus or Moses or the Israelites being in Egypt during that time. So I agree with Time magazine if the Exodus occurred in 1445 BC during the 18th dynasty. I believe the Exodus did take place in 1445 BC, but not during the 18th dynasty, but rather the end of the 12th dynasty, as you are going to see, which is still 1445 BC. Now, there are some other problems here. We see some things that I'm going to skip up tonight, but I'll just kind of leave it up here just to let you kind of look at it, but I got to save some time. I want you to understand that really the Exodus is not about the Pharaohs either, who it was. The Pharaoh is about, or the Exodus is about the God of the Exodus. That's the point that we're supposed to be taking from this story. And when we see the 18th dynasty, there is no destruction or collapse like the Bible would say there was when the army is destroyed. So in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, this is one of the reasons people always say, well, it's got to be Ramses, because look, Ramses is mentioned in scripture. They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So how can you have the Exodus taking place in the end of the 12th dynasty when Ramses isn't until the 18th dynasty? Well, I think it's because that the word Ramses there isn't really the city of Ramses. Well, it used to be, but prior to that, it was called Avaris, more than likely. And I'm going to show you some pictures of Avaris here coming up. But I believe Avaris, there's no question, was a place where there were Israelites. And it was later, the name of that city was changed to Ramses. And this is something we see a lot in scripture. It's called an anachronism, where when they're writing things down, they're writing things down that had happened years earlier. And so as they write it down, they're associating the name that that city is called now, not what it was called when that destruction took place. A couple of examples. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 14, and in Judges 18:29, it says that the city was originally called Laish and not Dan until after the conquest, which is long after Genesis 14. And so here we see a name of a town being called something that it wasn't during the time the event took place. The city of Luz is changed to the name Bethel in Genesis chapter 28, not until chapter 28, but in Genesis 12:8 and 13:3, it is called Bethel. Long before, or it is even called Bethel. In Genesis 12, it's called Luz, but they're not writing Genesis 12 until after Luz had been changed to Bethel. Same kind of thing here with Ramses. And I could give you so many examples of this kind of thing happening. These are all some, and this doesn't even scratch the surface. So not unique, not crazy to say that Ramses is probably the city of Avaris, but certainly not the city of Ramses there in Exodus. Now, as I said, I believe that it's going to be in the end of the 12th dynasty. And it isn't that I'm going to say 1445 has changed. I believe the Exodus was in 1445 BC. So we're not adjusting that time frame. We're simply adjusting the time frame of the reign of Egypt. Remember I said that it was 3100 BC that is generally accepted for the beginning of Egypt. I believe it was 2100 BC. And when you do that, then that makes the first dynasty at 2100. And you move to 1445 BC, and now it is the 12th dynasty, not the 18th dynasty. That's all it is. Now you say, well, you can't just move things around because you want to and make up whenever the Egyptian, country started. Well, I agree. I'm not just making things up here. There are good reasons for this. Let me explain to you, first of all, how we get to this 3100 BC date. There was an Egyptian priest by the name of Manetho, and he lived around 300 BC. And when Alexander the Great came in and whatnot, when they conquered Egypt, they said, we want you to tell us who are all of the pharaohs and how long did they reign? Well, when you're conquered by somebody, you don't just tell them no, or I don't know. You're going to write something down. And Manetho records all the names of all the pharaohs and how many years they reigned. So this is what we get. Now, Manetho is an interesting guy because do you know that we do not have a single, not one record of Manetho? Well, how do we know what he said then? Well, because we have a few people who record what Manetho said. The problem is, not only is the original of Manetho gone, and we only have people quoting him, but those who quote him contradict themselves. In other words, one says one thing, another says another. Who's right? We don't know. And so some of the people that are even quoting Manetho are unreliable. We could probably throw them out anyway. And most of the people who quote Manetho say that Manetho recorded that these dynasties, many of them ruled at the same time. That means you can't say this guy ruled 40 years and the next guy ruled 50 years, so you have 90 years of history. If they ruled with some overlapping time, this guy ruled 40 years, but this guy ruled 50 years, but 25 of those was within the 40 years of the other guy, that shortens the time period up. Now, again, the most reliable sources say Manetho said that they ruled contemporary. Now, that makes just common sense as well, because we know that the Egyptian Nile River there, it's about 12 kilometers wide is all, for 1,000 kilometers in length. That means that one pharaoh ruling by himself is going to have to rule 1,000 kilometers with a horse and chariot. That would be very difficult to do. And so what we see is it was recorded that there were northern and southern kings that ruled at the same time among the same dynasty. And that, like I said, just makes logical sense. That in itself shortens the time frame of the Egyptian history, because like I said, normally what they do is they're telling you that this guy ruled 40 years, this guy ruled 50 years, this guy ruled 100 years, this guy ruled whatever, and you add them all up and then you work backwards and it takes you to 3100 BC. Well, if they ruled contemporary, you can easily remove 750 to 1,000 years of history. Now, there's also something called the TIP, or the Third Intermediate Period. Now, the Third Intermediate Period is basically dynasties 21 through 25. And we can read this in secular books, by the way, here like Century of Darkness or A Test of Time. And you will see that many Egyptologists are saying this Third Intermediate Period never existed. We do not have any evidence of dynasties 21 through 25. That would remove 250 years of history right there. So, bottom line, you can not only remove time from kings ruling at the same time, but also from maybe some of them not even really being there, and that those dynasties didn't exist. And therefore, you can say you removed 1,000 years of history, and the Exodus is now in the end of the 12th dynasty. It's that simple. Now, with that foundation, I want to just give you some understanding here, and you're going to see why this is so important. First of all, where did the Egyptians come from? When you go to Egypt, you will see the Bank of Misr and so on. The reason that is because the word Egypt in Hebrew, even to this day, is Mizraim. Well, Mizraim was one of the sons of Ham. We see that in Genesis 10:6. The sons of Ham are Cush, Mizraim. All right, so Mizraim is clearly the father of the Egyptians. We know that's where they came from. And the first king of the first dynasty was probably Menes here. Eusebius and others talk about him and identified Menes as Mesraim. which is basically the grandson of Noah. So dynasty 4, then we see the pyramids start being built, but no question we can see that the Egyptians come from Ham, and probably they're from Menes, Mesraim, being the very first ruler there. Now, I'm not going to talk about some of the similarities between pyramids and as well as Egypt and honestly even Mexico and some here in the United States as well, but we won't get into that. The Tower of Babel, some people think the Beers Nimrods could be the Tower of Babel, that kind of thing. Like I said, we will not be getting into that. I do want to touch a little bit though on the fact that the people who built the pyramids were just slaves. We often see this in movies and whatnots. They're being whipped and it's just this drudgery. There's evidence to suggest that's not the case, that these people actually took pride in what they were doing, because we see here on this step pyramid, they identify the builders. It is written in the stone. It says the crew Cheops excites love. The crew in the white crown of Knu Khufu protected, and the crew Sahur is beloved. So they were taking pride in what they were building. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't use some slaves and whatnot, but what I am saying is that this was something that they were taking pride in. And, to build something of that magnitude, certainly I could see would be something to be proud of. Anyway, one of the greatest pyramid builders of all time here, we see Synepheru. Of the 4th dynasty. I'm not going to get into him much, but he built like the medium pyramid here. We only kind of see the main square part of it. You have his second pyramid is called the bent pyramid. And one of the interesting things about that, we often hear that they kind of messed up. And so things started, they miscalculated, and that's why it looks bent halfway up. But one of the things that's interesting about it is on the northeast corner, there is an inscription that says the 21st year of Synepheru. And then halfway up, it says 22nd year of Synepheru. The reason that's impressive is that would mean that they're laying a 2.5 ton block every 20 seconds for 12 hours a day to get that done in that amount of time. And so absolutely remarkable, the intelligence and the ability of what they are able to do in such a short period of time to build such a thing. I don't think could do that. Even today with our technology, we would not be able to do to the precision what they have and in that speed. So pretty impressive. So like I said, the Exodus took place around 1445 BC. With our corrected timeline and these pyramids now being built, one of the fascinating things is that it's the time that Abraham comes to Egypt that all of a sudden these pyramids start getting more accurate, more mathematically precise. And Josephus, a Jewish historian around the time of Christ, records that Abraham had communicated to the Egyptians arithmetic and delivered to them the science of astronomy. For before Abram came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning, for that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt. Now, by the way, even in archaeology, we have found when they have excavated that was a very mathematically advanced city. They had Pythagoras' theorem long before Pythagoras. They had all of these kind of things. They found school books and, like plates with all of the math kind of things written down on them. And so it's just speculation, of course, but nonetheless interesting that the time that Abraham enters Egypt is when we see the pyramids improving after the corrected timeline here. And so maybe Josephus is onto something here. Herodotus recorded that it took 3 monthly shifts of 100,000 workers in each shift, 20 years to build the great Khufu Cheops pyramid here, 479 feet tall. Some of the stones in there are up to 15 tons. A total of 2.3 million blocks. That means 12 hours a day for 20 years, 26.3 stones would need to be laid every hour, or just under 2 minutes for each one. That is absolutely amazing. And this is what they have done. So I'm not going to get any more into the pyramid building, but I do want to show you this. Here is a cistern, and this is in the city of Dothan. Now, you might recall Dothan is the city when Joseph went to check on his brothers. He went to find them. They weren't where they were supposed to be, so he went to Dothan where they were. And he was then thrown into a cistern. Well, here's a cistern in Dothan. I don't believe this is the one he was thrown in necessarily. Obviously, this one has been restored a little bit. You can see some of the older rocks there on the bottom. But nonetheless, this is the type of thing that he would have been thrown into. Now, when is this? Like I said, I believe it's around the 12th dynasty, the beginning. We see Sisostris the first here. And this, we know this is Sisostris because his cartouche tells us who this is. And by the way, sometimes you might see different names for some of these pharaohs. And that's because these guys had birth names. Then they had like king names. Sometimes they were given extra names for based on what they were doing, almost like what we give nicknames to our kids sometimes. But anyway, they had a number of different names. So Sisostris the first is one of the ones that's most commonly used. Anyway, Sisostris the first, he is ruling, I believe, when Joseph is coming into town. And here's a couple of reasons why. We see that he is almost always pictured with a shepherd's staff. Now, even the Bible tells us that Egyptians viewed shepherds as detestable. So why would an Egyptian pharaoh have a shepherd's staff in his hand? Well, the records tell us it's because he wanted to be viewed as a shepherd of people. And so he was very good to the people. He was a good pharaoh, and the people loved him. Now, there is evidence to support this as well, because when we see statues of Sisostris, he almost always has a nose. What's that mean? Well, you're going to see a lot of the noses will be broken off on statues. That's because the Egyptians had this religious belief that when you died, your spirit would exit your nose. And by the way, they would take your brains and a lot of your organs out of your nose and whatnot as well. But bottom line is that in the afterlife, it worked the same way. Your spirit would exit the nose. So even in your statues, they would break off the nose, trapping your spirit inside so that they were not allowed to basically go and enjoy the afterlife. So if you were a pharaoh that was not liked, they would try to deface your face. And that's what they would end up doing. So here are some more pictures of Sisostris the first. The interesting thing about it is his tomb has never been excavated. We know where it's at, but it is underwater. And because of that, it's very dangerous, and it has never been excavated. I would really love to see what else they could find inside Sisostris's tomb and whatnot. But bottom line is, we do have statues of him and some other records to saying what he did. For example, this obelisk here called the Pillar of On. Now, it's interesting that it's called the Pillar of On because if you recall, when Joseph came, he married a priest of the daughter of On. Something that was a kind of a key figure at the time here with this pharaoh reigning. Here's a throne that is from this period of history that pharaohs used. Maybe Joseph sat on one like that. We also see the chariots at that time looked like this. And so maybe Joseph rode one of those. But it's a possibility that this Joseph is a guy named Mentuhotep. Now, Mentuhotep, there's a couple of different Mentuhoteps too, by the way. But anyway, Joseph could have been this Mentuhotep. There's a dark Mentuhotep and a light Mentuhotep. The dark one is like black. But anyway, this Mentuhotep is interesting because we see that the Bible tells us in Genesis 41 that you shall be over my house. Pharaoh is talking to Joseph here. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Let me tell you something, that's rare. That was not an everyday occurrence. But this is what he's saying. Now, this is what the Egyptian records say of Mentuhotep. When he also held the office of the chief treasurer, as did the powerful vizier Mentuhotep under Sisostris I, the account which he could give of himself read like the declaration of the king's power. So, in other words, whatever Mentuhotep said, it was as good as the Pharaoh saying it. And that is exactly what the Bible says happened here with Joseph. Not only that, but he goes on here, the Egyptian records tell us that he appears as the alter ego of the king. When he arrived, the great personages bowed down before him at the outer door of the royal palace. Now, this is exactly what the Bible tells us as well, is that people would bow down before Joseph as he would go throughout from one place to another. Another interesting connection is the fact that it was during the reign of Sisostris I that there is a canal that brings water into town. This canal in the Fayum is called Bar Yusuf. And when you go and you ask the natives, what does Bar Yusuf means? It means basically Joseph's Canal. Well, why is it called Joseph's Canal? We don't know. That's their answer. Can I make a suggestion? Maybe it's called Joseph's Canal because Joseph was in charge of doing it, because Joseph had a dream that said that there was a 7-year famine coming. And so to prepare for that famine, they brought water into the city through this special canal. So is it a coincidence that we have Mentuhotep that is like second in power to the king, that we're building a canal at the same time into the city? Or is there a connection here? Well, before we make any decisions, let's look at some other things that are interesting here. Throughout most of the Middle Kingdom, which is when the 12th dynasty is at, the Egyptian districts were called nomes. And they had these wealthy monarchs, basically kind of governor type thing, that ruled over each one of these nomes, these districts. Well, what's fascinating is it is at this time that this changes and the wealth goes to Pharaoh instead of these governor of districts. And why would that be? Could it be that it is that way because of Joseph's famine policy where they had to buy grain? Why does the power leave the people and go to Pharaoh at this time in the 12th dynasty? It's a question that needs to be answered. We also see downstream from Bar Yusuf, that canal, there is a tomb of Bani Hassan where there are tombs from the 12th dynasty up in these hills. And one of the tombs there, they, as I said, have hieroglyphs and all of these pictures and things in the tombs. One of them has these pictures here, and it shows this nomarch and people coming into them bringing gifts. Now, what I want you to see is that these people are bearded. First of all, Israelites always had beards, and the Egyptians did not. So these are not Egyptian people. Also fascinating, they do look like Semitic people, Jewish people, and it's no accident that they have coats of many colors, something that we do know that was given to the Israelite culture there as well. And so another very interesting connection that these people are bringing gifts to them. Now, the other thing is, here is another tomb, tomb of Ameni. And when you go inside there, here is just a sign for his tomb. He was the provincial governor during the reign of Sisostris I, when Joseph possibly was the prime minister. And so just another kind of lower governor. Here's his tomb. Here is what it says on the walls. What does it say? It says this: no one was unhappy in my days, not even in the years of famine, for I had tilled all the fields of the nome of Ma up to its southern and northern frontiers. Thus I prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food which it produced. No hungry man was in it. I distributed equally to the widow as to the married woman. And so here we're seeing a famine. And not just that there was a famine, but there seemed to be knowledge that there was a famine coming. And it says that he prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food which it produced. How did they know it was coming? Well, it seems to be Joseph and his dreams. It sounds like they were preparing for this 7-year famine. Also, in the southern Egypt, there's a cliff that has markings of the Nile River here. And basically, it marks how high the waters would be from year to year. And there was a flood that was 4 times the normal levels in the time of Amenemhet III and Sisostris III. And the same time, this is when a city called Avaris is built. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's also about the same time Bar Yusuf is made. And so this is not going to be an accident as well. Could it be that this is what caused some of the famines? That there was actually not like a drought, but too much water that washed everything out, just like we've seen here in the Midwest last couple of years, in Iowa especially. So maybe that's another reason for this famine, is because of too much water. And just like when we see in Iowa, some of those crops, they weren't able to plant for a 3rd year because it really had ruined the soil and stripped the topsoil and all that kind of thing as well. Anyway, there's another thing called Hungry Rock south of Aswan on the Nile River. It has the 34 vertical columns with writings on them. And this is what it says: I was in mourning on my throne. Those of the palace were in grief. My heart was in great affliction because Happy, the river god, had not come in a time of 7 years. So Happy is basically, we're going to see a picture of her later, but everything has a god here in Egypt. But it's saying that there was a period of 7 years where Happy did not come. There was no rain. It was a drought. So if it wasn't a flood, maybe it's a drought. Grain was scant, kernels were dried up, scarce was every kind of food. Every man robbed his twin. Those who entered did not go. Children cried, youngsters fell, the hearts of the old were grieved, legs drawn up, they hugged the ground, their arms clasped about them. Courtiers were needy, temples were shut, shrines covered with dust. Everyone was in distress. And so it continues here, taking us to Avaris. We're seeing that everybody's in distress because there's no food and there's famines going on. Avaris, maybe, as I said, Ramses was really Avaris. Here is some of the interesting things about this city. It is in the 13th dynasty, that it is a Semitic city. That means Jews lived there. And there is one house here that is very unique. And that's what you're seeing here. There's even a little pyramid here for it. It's got 12 grave memorials and 12 pillars, which is interesting because if you remember, Joseph had 11 brothers. Now, one is a pyramid, as I said, right here, but it's not the king's pyramid. There's a statue inside this pyramid, and I'm going to show you that statue in a moment, but he has multicolors. Now, remember, Joseph's tomb would be empty because when they left Egypt, they took Joseph's bones with him, and there were no bones found in this tomb. It is an empty tomb. But notice this coat of many colors that this man who lived in Avaris, a Semitic city, wore. Now, other interesting things is that the cemeteries of this area all show that the normal infant death, basically, of a time period elsewhere is about 25% of the infants die. But here in the town of Avaris, 50% of the population of death were infants less than 3 months old. The graves of the adults were 60% female. And that's interesting because we see that the men are basically being killed, the male babies. Remember that? Pharaoh said, kill the babies. And that's why Moses is eventually put into the river to try and hide him. And so you're going to see a high number of babies being killed and not very many men because they were killing all the male babies. So that is not an accident either, I don't think, of what we're seeing here in Avaris. Not only that, but we also get to see a papyrus that is now in the Brooklyn Museum. And here in the Brooklyn Museum, it's from the Middle Kingdom again, the time period we're talking about, the beginning of the 13th dynasty. It has a list of slave names. 70% of the names that are on this papyrus are Semitic or Jewish names, like Issachar, Asher, Shipra, which by the way was one of the Hebrew midwives that hid the babies or let the babies keep, basically not kill the babies when the Jewish women were having them. Most of the names are female again, supporting the fact that there were more females and males because the males had been killed off. And so all of this continuing to add up is suggesting that this clearly are the Jews living. It's just not in the 18th dynasty, it's in the 12th dynasty. So maybe if Time magazine would start looking in the 12th and 13th dynasty, they wouldn't be able to say there's no evidence of Moses or the Israelites in Egypt. It's everywhere. Now, we also know this, that there is a new king. When Joseph dies, the Bible says there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. Right? So we know Sisostris I was very good, a shepherd of the people. Sisostris II, I think he would have known Joseph. Sisostris III is going to come around. And by this time, you would be able to forget who Moses or Joseph was and really not care about him. Well, here is a picture of Sisostris III. He is always pictured as this stern-looking, well, a jerk-like king. Notice his nose is broke off. He was a mean guy. He's got this scowl on his face. All of the pictures or statues of him show him with this scowl. This would have been the king, just following the timeline, that would be at the end of the Middle Kingdom, and he would have been the one that had enslaved the Israelites after Joseph had died. He didn't care who Joseph was anymore, and enslaves them. And so here's another picture of him. You can always see him because he's always got this scowl. Now, we also see then his son comes up, Amenemhet III, and he's looks a little bit better than his father, but still a little disagreeable. But this would have been the one that Moses would have been born near the beginning of his reign. Now, one thing, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it tonight, but I do have a message on it. We often hear that the Israelites were slaves for 400 or 430 years in Egypt. Wrong. And this is biblical, by the way. At most, they would have been slaves for 230 years, but probably only about 120 to 140 years. And I can prove this biblically. All right. But anyway, there are good reasons for it. I'm not going to get into that, but just don't have this idea of 400 years in your mind. Probably 120 to 140. So anyway, his son here, Amenemhet III, and he ruled for 46 years at the same time with his father, Sisostris III, that mean-looking guy. Now, this is one of the pyramids that Amenemhet III builds. Now, what's fascinating about that is this isn't the kind of pyramid you're used to seeing. You're used to seeing these big 2.5-ton blocks, aren't you? Well, here, these are bricks. Sun-dried bricks with straw in them, not these 2.5-ton stones like you see here. As a matter of fact, here are some of the bricks. You can even see the straw inside. Remember that the Bible told or says that Pharaoh told the Israelites that they had to get more straw and make more bricks when they were talking about wanting to go out and worship God. He says, well, apparently you have too much free time, so go get your own straw and make more bricks. And so it's during this time, Amenemhet III, that these are the bricks that are being used in this pyramid that he's building. Again, just a coincidence, or are we starting to see some things coming together here? Now, nearby the tomb of Sisostris is another city, not just Avaris, but a city called Kahun. And, you know, there was a lot of Israelites, so more than likely there was more than just one Israelite settlement. Well, Kahun, it doesn't look like much today. This is it from the top of Sisostris's tomb. It is just like a desert wasteland. But it was excavated over 100 years ago by a guy named Sir Flinders Petrie. And when he excavated, this is basically what he drew, what the city looked like. What they did is they would go down a street and excavate it and throw everything on the other side. Then when they got done with that, they would simply move over excavate it and throw everything on what they just finished excavating on the other side and just keep moving over like that. And so that's what you're seeing here. Not a lot to look at, but like I said, they drew pictures. And then when they would find things, they would keep it and so on. Well, there are books written about Kahun. One of them called here The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt by Rosalie David. And this is what she says describing what goes on there in the town of Kahun. It is apparent that the Asiatics were present in the town in some numbers. This may have reflected the situation elsewhere in Egypt. Their exact homeland in Syria or Palestine cannot be determined. The reason for their presence in Egypt remains unclear. Isn't that interesting? They are Asiatics in great numbers, and where they come from, we don't know, and why they're there, we don't know. You know why they don't know? Because this is in the 12th and 13th dynasties. That can't be the Egyptians, or the Israelites, I mean. They're not until the 18th dynasty. So this is very confusing to her. Well, if the calendar is corrected, and we see that the timeline has been off all these years, then that explains exactly why they're finding Asiatics here in great numbers. And their presence is there because they are slaves. Now, we're going to come back to Kahun in a little bit, but before we do, I want you to see this. Pharaoh decreed that all the baby boys were to be thrown into the river and drowned. Remember that? Killed. Well, it's interesting because in the town of Kahun, almost every home, inside the home, buried in the floor, was a box like this. And almost every home, as I said, had that. Let me show you what they say about these boxes in this book. Larger wooden boxes, probably used originally to store clothing and other possessions, were discovered underneath the floors of many houses at Kahun. They contained babies, sometimes buried 2 or 3 to a box and aged only a few months at death. Isn't that interesting? That we have all these babies being buried in their homes. Why? Do you suppose that when Pharaoh said, hey, kill your babies, and they throw them into the river, do you think that a mother of that child is just going to say, oh, well, see you later, see you in the afterlife? Or is she going to be bawling and crying and chasing down the river, watching where that baby is going, trying to find it along the banks to pick it up and give it a respectable, proper burial? You bet. And maybe that's why some 2 to 3 to a box. Because if they found somebody else's baby, they would also do the respectable thing and bury that baby. So it's also interesting, we see that Moses is hid until he is 3 months old, and most of these babies are 2 to 3 months of age. Well, they hide Moses in the banks, among the reeds, and he was placed there intentionally. They knew. Miriam stood off at the side just waiting for Pharaoh's daughter to come. She knew Pharaoh's daughter was going to go there. Why? Because she went there every day. Why? Remember, the Nile River is a god to the Egyptians. And it is basically a fertility god. Here's what it says. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and the maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to fetch it. Why is she there? I'm going to propose because she was praying for a baby. Why? Because Amenemhet III's daughter, would have been Sobek-Neferu. And Sobek-Neferu, the records of Egypt tell us that she was barren and had no children. Keep in mind, Amenemhet III needs a son to rule. He doesn't have any. He has a daughter. The only hope is for this daughter to have a child that can then rule. And she's barren. Do you think that a barren woman who it would have been so important for her to have a child would be going every day to the Nile River, Happy, the fertility god, and saying, please, Happy, give me a son. And then one day, here is a baby crying in the reeds? Because think about this. It's not like she was bringing home a puppy. She was bringing home an enemy that her father has been saying, kill these babies. So why would Amenemhet III even allow her to bring it home? Unless this was a sign from the gods. Again, speculation, but it seems to fit that this is quite possible. Here's a picture of Happy, the fertility god. And so maybe that is why Moses was allowed to be kept by this person. Now, by the way, Sobek-Neferu will rule for 4 years, and she rules because she has no heir. So if she was the one that drew out Moses, remember Moses ran away, and he would not be the heir anymore either. Well, he runs away, and 40 years later, then Moses returns to Egypt. By that time, you have, according to our corrected timeline, a guy named Neferhotep I of the 13th dynasty that would have been Pharaoh. And this is the very last king before those Asiatics leave Kahun. Moses, this is the one that he would have come to and said, let my people go. Not Ramses, Neferhotep I. And here are some things from his time period. Remember, Moses threw a snake down and whatnot, so it's just kind of an interesting connection. Pharaoh refused to let the people go. So what happens? There are these 10 plagues that come. And as a result, we see that the last plague is the one that breaks the camel's back. And that is the plague of the firstborn, where even Pharaoh's firstborn son died. Well, following the timeline, guess what? Neferhotep has an oldest son named Wa-Neferhotep. And Wa-Neferhotep never rules, never gets the throne. Why? Egyptologists don't know why. Can I make a suggestion? Because he died as the Passover. That firstborn, the plague of the firstborn, makes sense. And by the way, another interesting thing is Neferhotep's body has never been found. They don't know why. Can I make a suggestion? He's at the bottom of the Red Sea. Ramses is not, but Neferhotep is. There is a papyrus in the Leiden Museum. It's called the Admonitions of the Egyptian Sage, and it describes what I believe are the plagues of Egypt during this time. Look what it says. Behold, Egypt is fallen, the pouring of water. He who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery. Well, look what it says in Exodus 9 or 4 verse 9. Some take water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground. Very interesting connection. We see this as well. The heart of the violent plague stalks through the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. Does a man drink from it? He rejects it as human. He thirsts for water. Just like the Bible says, all the waters of the Nile were turned to blood. The river smelled so bad they couldn't drink it. And this is Egyptian records. Gates, columns, walls are consumed with fire. Men are few. He that lays his brother in the ground is everywhere. But the son of the highborn no longer to be recognized. Why? Because the stranger people from outside have come into Egypt. Well, who's to blame for taking even the highborn and bringing them low? Strangers from outside? Well, that's exactly what we see when the firstborn male of every household died at the Passover, unless the Passover blood was there. Gone is the barley of abundance. Food supplies are running short. The nobles hunger and suffer. Those who had shelter are in the dark of the storm. Darkness, interesting. Food supplies running short, interesting, because that's exactly what happened. We even see that the Lord rained down hail on the land in Egypt. And all of these storms that came brought so much destruction. It says the slave takes what he finds, gold, lapis, all of these precious stones. Wait a minute, how are the slaves having the right to take all of these things? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Well, that's exactly what the Bible says. When they left Egypt, these slaves went and asked them for all their stuff, and they gave it to them. They plundered the Egyptians when they left. And it's not an accident that, look, I have these things underlined, that the very thing that the Bible says that they had, that they took from Egypt, are the very same things that are mentioned in this papyrus that the slaves took. Just matches up, and everywhere you go. Wailing is throughout the land, mingled with lamentation. No, but corn has perished everywhere. People are stripped of clothing, perfume, and oil. Everyone says there's no more. The storehouse is bare. It's come to this. The king has been taken away by poor men. The king had been taken away. How? By poor people? How? Okay, everybody's wailing, just like the Bible says here. Well, I'd say this is the Exodus. Going back to this town of Kahun, it says it's apparent that the completion of the king's pyramid wasn't the reason that Kahun's inhabitants eventually deserted the town, abandoning the tools and other possessions in their shops and houses. In other words, she doesn't know why they left so quickly. Can I make another suggestion? It's called the Exodus. It was speedy. That's why they didn't leaven their bread. They were to eat with their clothes tucked in, ready to leave, because it was sudden. She goes on, there are different opinions of how this period of occupation grew to a close. The range and type of articles of everyday use which were left behind in the houses may indeed suggest that the departure was sudden and unpremeditated. In other words, they left all their stuff behind, just like the Exodus. It was sudden and unpremeditated. And so, guys, if we follow this through, it continues. They went and crossed the Red Sea, kind of right there, kind of by the arrow then, is where I believe they crossed. I've been there. I've done all kinds of research on this as well. But bottom line, Josephus, quoting Manetho, now, right after this says, there was a king of ours whose name was Timaeus. Under him it came to pass, I know not how, that God was averse to us, angry. And there came after a surprising manner of men of a noble birth out of the eastern parts, and boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and subdued it by force, yet without a battle. What? Here we've got these uneducated, poor people coming in and conquering Egypt without a battle. How do you conquer a world power without a battle? What if there's no army to protect it? You see, he goes on and says that these were the Hixos. You know, we know very little about the Hixos. The Hixos Dynasty, they were uncultured people. Very few artifacts or information has been found about them. But this is what Manetho said. They burned down our cities, demolished the temples of the gods, used all the inhabitants after a barbarous manner. Some they slew, led their children and their wives in slavery. This nation was styled Hyksos. Some people think that these were the Amalekites because when the Israelites went, they meet these people. And I'm sure they said, hey, where are you going? Well, we're going to the promised land. What, did the Egyptians let you go? Oh, no. Let me tell you what happened. You mean God wiped out the Egyptians? Yep. The whole army? Yep. Well, have a nice trip. Hey, guys, come on, let's go. There's no army. Let's go take over. It just makes sense. And that they would go and take over without a battle. Well, with that, guys, I'm out of time, but we can follow this through and you will be able to see now with this corrected timeline, which Pharaoh it is that kills Josiah. You can see which Pharaoh's daughter that we see Solomon marrying. And a lot of puzzle pieces start coming together. And Pharaohs will be talked about where, they take the 300 golden shields that Solomon had made that Rehoboam replaces with bronze shields. And you go see in that Pharaoh on his wall, he has a battle of a list of all the things he brings back from this battle of Kadesh, which means holy city. And there are 300 gold shields on there. Accident or a corrected timeline solving all these issues. So anyway, with that, I'll open it up for some questions here. Like I said, that was slide 118 out of 229. So
Wow.
you can see that it follows quite a bit through.
That was great. That was a lot of information.
I really enjoyed that. And I had made a comment that we'll have to have him back.
I think they want to hear more about the pyramids.
There's so much interesting things there to look at for sure.
Well, we do have a few questions. So let's start with an easy one. How long is a dynasty?
Everyone was different. A dynasty was basically a family line. And so some of them were very short. Some of them were 100 years or more. It just all depended on the family. And so when you were a father and your son could no longer rule or you didn't have any children, then oftentimes that dynasty ended as a new family line came into existence.
Okay. And why did Egyptians have two different types of languages?
I'm not sure. I think it's probably just because of just like today we can see that in different parts of the world, that you had kind of two, the word's kind of escaping me, but dialects, I guess, is what I'm looking at. Basically one of those kind of things. And so Egyptian hieroglyphs are a lot more complicated and deep than people realize. In some senses, you think, oh, it's really simple, barbaric. Not at all. It's much like Hebrew, where the Hebrew, every letter has a picture, and those pictures actually help describe the word. So as an example, the word Abba or Ab in Hebrew, you have Aleph Bet. Aleph is always pictured, has a meaning of like strong or authority first, and then Bet is pictured as a house. And so the word Ab, father, means the strong one of the house. Things like that. And so the depth of the Hebrew language is amazing. It's the same thing with the hieroglyphs. It's not just like, too dumb to put words together, but the pictures describe and have meaning to it, so that the pictures together give you a definition of the word. So it's really kind of complex.
Okay. And okay, so June put out a question. She said, I thought the coat of many colors was stained with blood and brought to Joseph's father, which we read that in Genesis 37, that the brothers brought him the coat to convince him that Joseph was dead. So Joseph would not have had his coat in Egypt. Why would we see Egyptian statues of Joseph in a coat of many colors? And Rachel offered another comment that maybe could be an answer, but what are your thoughts about this too? Do you think Joseph ended up sharing his story of how he got to Egypt?
Well, I think eventually he probably did, but this coat of many colors we even see in archaeology and whatnot. This isn't just a unique thing. It was often given to people who were in charge. And so that might be one of the reasons why his brothers were a little bit jealous and envious. And so I'm not saying that it was the coat of many colors, because absolutely that one was taken, ripped up, blood. He didn't have that one back, but nonetheless, he may have had others in. And possibly his father, when his father got there, gave him another one. There's all these possibilities we just can't say, but nonetheless, it's not an uncommon thing that we see those kinds of things throughout history. Even you saw in that one tomb, a lot of those guys had colorful clothing, that many colors on it, because it was a sign of authority and basically not being a slave. So.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Brian, do you have any books or videos available for purchase with the information about the pharaohs?
I do. As a matter of fact, I think I offered this last time, I don't remember, but we have a set of 30 DVDs, about 60 hours somewhere in there of information. And if anybody wants those, they're 90% off right now. So you can have the entire set for $50. And this DVD, which is almost 2 hours long, is in that set. And they all have downloadable worksheets and things like that. And so to get that, they just have to call me, and they can call our office at 402-519-0301.
Okay.
What do they cover?
Oh boy, it covers dinosaurs, Ice Age, pre-flood world. Do aliens exist? The tabernacle of Scripture. It talks about pharaohs. We talk about archaeology. We talk about the stars and astronomy, scientific evidences of a young Earth, textbook inaccuracies, the godly family. Let's see, frequently asked questions. We have the unholy spirit in the church, that kind of talks about some of the things going on in churches today. The process and miracle of birth is discussed. Homosexuality. What is all, what do we do with all of that, and what is it going on here today? That's another topic, and just a number of other things. Those are the ones that are just kind of popping in my mind. Amazing Animals is another one. Attack on Christianity deals with some of those type of things. The dating methods. explaining an old earth compromise. When many creationists tried to tie millions of years into the Bible, we show why that doesn't work, why that's a compromise, how that affects the gospel, as well as many other things like that. So.
Can you repeat the phone number again that people can call to order that?
You bet. It's 402-519-0301. And we're also doing a special on our books. You can have all 4 of my books, at least the ones that we have in print still, for $20. Normally they're one for $15, but you get all 4 for $20. And that one is Genesis, Yesterday's Answers to Today's Problems. Revelation, all of God's Word revealed. Doubts About Creation, Not After This. And Evangelution. So those are the 4 books. So.
Okay. Robin, did you have any questions?
When can we have you back to finish on those pyramids?
Yeah.
I was just kidding. I was like, oh, here it comes. And then you changed. Because I love the pyramids.
Yeah, it's fascinating to go inside them as well. It's just a very unique experience for sure.
So, well, we're going to be taking a break, but would you be willing to come back and talk about that?
Yeah, I definitely would be happy to do that sometime.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Okay.
You spoke of it being only 200 and some years that from the time that Joseph went down until they got out of Egypt. Was this because when the Bible speaks of 400 years, it's dating from when Abraham first went down?
Yes, that's part of it. One passage says 400 years, one passage says 430. That is not a contradiction, and that is not a round number. Depending on where you start and who you're looking at, it is 400 and 430 years. One will include the 40 years of desert wandering as well. But it is not just the time they were in Egypt. The Bible even says that they will be enslaved and persecuted. They were persecuted even before they got to Egypt, and even 40 years after Egypt as well. And so by looking at those things, that's a big part of it, yes. And so you can, beyond a shadow of a doubt, prove that it was not 400 years that they were in Egypt. So, yeah.
What was the name of the king again? Terry, let's put that in the chat. Or the Pharaoh that was killed. What was his name again? Nofer or something?
At the bottom of the Red Sea, Neferhotep the First.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to write that. Okay.
Neferhotep.
Okay. Brian, tell people one more time how they can find you, your website and information.
Yeah, our website is creationinstruction@gmail.com. I guess that's the email. The website's creationinstruction.org. And yeah, that's probably the best way, right through there. And then again, they could call at 402-519-0301.
Okay.
And Brian does answer.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And then our information, again, we're Creation Fellowship Santee, and you can find our past videos on YouTube or on our Facebook page. Like and follow us so that you get notifications when we go live. You can sign up for our email list by emailing creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. So Brian, we're going to go ahead and turn off the recording.